Welcome back to my course, World History. Last time we talked about scientific revolution and enlightenment. Today, before we take our test, I'm going to tell you a few things about American Revolution, which was the child of enlightenment. So the topic of the current lecture is the American Revolution. Okay, and I encourage you actually to view the American Revolution 1776 not as something separate from what we did last time, but an integral part of the scientific revolution and enlightenment. And I will explain to you throughout this lecture why we need to do it in order for you not to treat the American Revolution, which we frequently do, as a separate event, decontextualized. That's what a lot of people do. They take it out of context. They look at the American Revolution irrespective of the historical context it had taken place and analyze it from a present viewpoint. Okay, I'm a historian. I'm going to analyze the American Revolution as a historian, as something that had happened at that time in that context, and we need to remember the historical conditions of the American Revolution, forces that shaped it, in order not to fall in this trap of the present viewpoint, because frequently people analyze, as I told you many times, people analyze past events from a present viewpoint, and they apply to our ancestors the standards of the present generation, which is a big mistake. Okay, history is a foreign country. It's a metaphor, of course. History should be judged on its own terms. Okay, that's what I welcome you to do when you consider any historical episode, and especially the American Revolution, which frequently becomes an object of various political controversies. Here we go. Let's start. First, last time when we discussed enlightenment, which grew out of the scientific revolution, the concern about natural rights, natural laws, remember, and the quest for a model of a good government. Remember, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Adam Smith, Montesquieu, Voltaire, all these names we mentioned last time. These were the people who wanted to find some blueprints of a good government, okay, or natural laws of society, because Mother Nature lived according to natural laws, and we look for these natural laws, we discover them, we use them to perfect the life of our society, and we have to do the same thing in our society. Okay, not only in the nature, but in our society, we look for natural laws, and we are going to perfect our life. Okay, so the American Revolution was driven by these ideas to find some blueprints of natural laws that could be used to organize the life of political life, economical life of society, in order to kind of make society perfect. Okay, the roots of American Revolution should be located in the Puritan element that had shaped the culture of New England. Okay, of course, you can tell me that you cannot say that what later became known as the United States was only shaped by the Puritans. Yes, of course, there were many other cultures and traditions that contributed to the rise of what later we call the United States. But in the beginning, it was the Puritan element that was the core. Or let me put it wider, it was the North Protestant element that shaped the culture of New England, the foundation of American Republic. That was the major element, I repeat. They were Puritans, they were also Swedes, they were also Germans in Pennsylvania, people of different Christian denominations. Again, predominantly they were Protestants, Quakers, Anabaptists, Methodists, you name them, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, that these people who grew out of the Puritan tradition. Of course, there were some Catholics, okay, because there were a lot of different denominations, but predominantly it was the Protestant element. Remember what was special about Protestants? Okay, Protestants were heavily decentralized culture. They didn't recognize the power of the one. Okay, that they didn't want to recognize the Roman Pope, who should stood above all Christians to tell them what to do. Protestants became a bunch of locally organized communities. Okay, and they debated among each other what kind of self-government they should have. These religious communities of Protestants who were fixated on the Bible. Remember, the Bible reading was the major thing for them, and for some of them was the Geneva Bible. Geneva Bible was the major book. Okay, that was later that King James Bible that became the foundation. For many of them, for many Puritans, it was the Geneva Bible. Remember what was special about Geneva Bible? Check our lecture on Reformation. Okay, the Bible of Liberty, Geneva Bible. Anyway, this Protestant, Puritan, or if I said wider, broadly speaking, Protestant element laid the foundation for culture, laid the foundation for the United States. And fixation on local self-government, fixation on the Bible, again, the culture of reading. I want to repeat, a lot of Puritans, Protestants in general, later German Lutherans who came to North America, eastern part of North America, they were highly educated people already because they were obsessed with reading the Bible. Okay, 95% of Puritans who came here, they were educated people. They knew how to read and to write, men, women, and children. You will never see it in any other part of the world. Never. At that time. Only here. Again, Northern Europe and here. That's fact. Medicinal fact, as they say. So the fixation on the Bible reading and fixation on local self-government. At first, of course, it was a religious self-government. Okay? Of course, there was a debate how our local self-government should be organized. These religious communities debated, they quarreled with each other. And on many occasions, they attacked each other. For example, so-called Presbyterians, a faction, Protestant faction that grew out of this Puritan element. They believed that it was so-called presbyters, okay, enlightened religious leaders. They should rule the communities, okay. There's bishops, local bishops, okay. People should elect them, and they should rule the life of religious communities, okay. But Congregationalists, another group of Puritans, which also was an offshoot of Puritans, they said, no, we don't need this. Even if we elect these local bishops, it's not self-government, it's still authoritarian. So we need to give total power to local congregations. So local congregations would direct their own life. They would elect ministers. So let local congregations speak up. They should have the final say. And of course, there were debates. There were also independents. Okay, Roger Williams, who said that the church and state should be separated. Okay, because worldly life should have nothing to do with religious life. Okay, don't mix these two things. See the separation of church and state. So a lot of conflicts, a lot of debates, because Puritans, Protestants in general, were people who were reading the Bible and had different interpretations of the Bible. So we have a lot of different denominations. So just remember for yourself that the Protestant culture was a heavily decentralized culture, unlike Catholic culture or some other cultures. Okay, so these type of people came to live here. Okay, why do I emphasize it here for you? Because I want to emphasize that out of this religious self-government, religious decentralization, gradually, not overnight of course, but gradually, political self-government emerged. Okay, the tradition of local self-government, local autonomy, these local communities which moved away from Europe because they hated this authoritarianism, they hated this, them being dominated not only by the Roman Pope, but those Puritans who moved away, escaped from England to here in North America. What they hate? They hated the English king to dominate their religious life. They hated to be dominated by the Anglican Church. Remember, Anglican Church was the conservative Protestant church, which hardly changed anything. They preserved a lot of Catholic rites and ceremonies, except one. In terms of administration, it was ruled by the English king instead of the Roman Pope. So they wanted to purify the church, Puritans, okay, hence the Puritans. And many of them wanted local religious communities to have power. Okay, they didn't want to be dominated by the king or the Roman Pope. Okay, so that's what they escaped from. And here in North America, they wanted to build this new Jerusalem. Okay, many of them wanted to build this city on the hill. It's a metaphor, Jerusalem. Okay, but what we need to remember is that by doing their religion, they promoted this local self-government. That's what is important for us to remember. Out of religion, we have this sparks of political autonomy, traditional self-government emerging, which people in other parts of the world either didn't have or had it in a very minuscule form. Okay. Of course, we have in other parts of Europe a similar tradition, like in Sweden, in Netherlands. But again, in Northern Europe, it was still dominated by the royal tradition. Royalty still dominated this local self-government. And these Protestant communities, predominantly Protestant communities, and Catholic communities as well, okay, who moved here to North America, they lived away from European domination, the hegemony of these kings and queens. We should talk about benign negligence. So Puritan communities, for instance, who lived in England at first and then moved here, they could not be monitored. They could not be controlled by the king, okay, because the king was far away. Or Catholics who moved here to North America, they couldn't be controlled by the Roman Pope. Again, I repeat, there were few Catholics. Mostly it was the Protestant element that populated New England, New York, Pennsylvania, okay, Vermont, Maine. Protestants mostly. In southern states, there were, I think in Virginia, there were some Catholics. Again, you Google it, North Carolina, I think. But mostly, like 80%, it was Protestants. England, Netherlands, Germany, Sweden. That's it. Anyway, it was hard for the European royalty, okay, for the English king, for the Swedish king, to control these people, okay? So what they did, they developed this powerful tradition of self-government. They didn't pay regular taxes, which back in Europe the others paid, okay? And many historians who write about the roots of American Revolution, they talk about the benign negligence by England. So these colonists were neglected, so they could spread the wings, okay? They not being monitored by the English king, okay? There was hardly anybody to harass them here. Of course, again, the English king, for instance, he appointed commissioners, he appointed some royal agents to control these colonies which were set up in North America. That's the fact of life, yes. But at the same time, you could not totally cage these farmers, okay, these trappers who moved here because many of them moved to the borderland. Again, you could not force them to pay taxes, for instance. You couldn't force them to pay some sales taxes. Okay. In fact, much of colonial trade in North America was smuggling goodies from Caribbean to North America and from New England to the Caribbean islands. Hardly anybody paid taxes. Okay, English taxes were ignored, and it was hard for England to kind of monitor and penalize them. Okay, there was no political power. Another thing, that's a second source of American Revolution, in addition to this Protestant tradition of decentralization plus benign negligence, Enlightenment. Okay, many so-called founding fathers like Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, you name them. Again, you know the names, famous names. These were the people who were saturated, who were kind of injected with the ideas of enlightenment, natural rights. They were talking about natural rights. They read Adam Smith. Okay, they read John Locke. So back and forth, many of them traveled to Europe. They read these books, or they ordered these books written by famous Enlightenment people whose names I mentioned last time, like Voltaire, Denis Diderot, okay, Isaac Newton. So that is why we're talking about the American Revolution of being a child of enlightenment. Okay, remember, people of enlightenment, they believed in progress. Okay, we can create this society that would progress, that all men were endowed with natural rights, okay, and representative government. Now, the immediate spark that ignited the American Revolution, it was a 7-year war. Okay, 7-year war, which England in 1750s, 1760s was fighting against France. Okay, I have to tell you a little bit of history originally. Okay, at first, France controlled a big chunk of North America. See right here, Canada and Louisiana. Again, Louisiana, by the way, was not the name of this small state which we have today, New Orleans, Gulf of Mexico. The name Louisiana was applicable to this huge area. Okay, it's a Mississippi and Missouri basin. Okay, it was called Louisiana. Canada, it was controlled by France, but again, when I say controlled, it has to be put in quotation marks, because France hardly could exercise physical control over this area. Why? Because there were hardly any French people. Formally, yes, they had Canada, they had a governor of Canada appointed from France, and they also claimed Louisiana. Louisiana was populated, of course, by a bunch of Native American groups. Okay, and they were about 30,000 of Coureurs du Bois. Coureurs du Bois, it's mountain men or trappers who roamed these areas. They married American Indian women, lived with them, traded goodies to European goodies to them. In exchange, they received pelts, furs from them. In the south, they traded for deer skins. Here, they traded for bison skins or for beaver skins. In northern part of Canada, Minnesota, okay, Ohio, beaver skins, bison skins, in central Louisiana, and deer skins. So hardly, it's a few people, 30,000 for this huge area, so hardly visible, right? So in reality, it was Native Americans who controlled this area, but formally France claimed it, okay? But in reality, American Indians controlled this area. Only Canada, yes, was a small part of area called Canada was controlled by France. And here we have New England, okay? New England, it was the area I just talked about, this populated by Protestants, this independent communities which created states. okay, a bunch of independent states, which treated each other as foreign countries, okay, because Protestants, they were heavily decentralized, unlike French Catholics, okay, because France was a Catholic country and the Roman Pope was the head of Catholics, okay. So formally they pledged allegiance to the Roman Pope. And these Courrier de Bois, these French trappers, and those artisans and fur trappers who lived in Canada, they were all Catholics, okay. So France competed with England, okay, for religious reasons, because England was a Protestant country, France was a Catholic country, and for economic reasons, okay. Originally, remember, England and Netherlands, they were fighting against Spain, because Spain was and Portugal were the major competitors. But England and Netherlands successfully squeezed out Spain from trade routes, okay. Even in Caribbean islands, where originally French had come to dominate the area, England actually squeezed them. England came to control the bunch of sugar plantations in the Caribbean islands, okay? So the Spanish Empire was going down, and we talked about it. But the France, another Catholic power that had no place to go except North America, moved here, claimed this area, took over a place called Canada, and started to compete with England, okay? And since they were on good terms with American Indians, French, they instigated some Native Americans against the English, okay, against the Protestants here, so there were some fights. Anyway, at some point, France and England started to fight each other. In fact, they were fighting each other in Europe, they were fighting each other in India, and they were fighting each other in North America about who would dominate these all these areas. And since we're talking about North America, here we're talking about who would dominate North America, England or France. And the English Protestants, they had superiority over French. Why? The French could not dominate the English simply because numerically, demographically, they were few. Those Protestant settlers, colonials as they were called, or colonists, who came to New England, they were numerous, they were many, because they came by families. Puritans came by big families, men, women, children, okay. As far as the French were concerned, they were mostly males, and plus they had to ask permission of the French king to come to North America, okay. Everything should be done through the king, okay. You couldn't come on your own to live in Canada or Louisiana. Unlike New England and the neighboring areas here in eastern part of North America, where people just could come on their own because they were private, independent people. They could create joint ventures, or many people came from England as indentured servants, so they put themselves in bondage, you know, pledging to work like 7 or 8 or 10 years if their passage to North America would be paid, okay. So it's called indentured servants, okay. And they lived here, okay. There were many of them. So here we have like between 30 and 40,000 people of French men in all these areas. But in New England and neighboring areas, by the 1700s, we already have a huge number of people. It was about 1 million people, okay, maybe less, okay. Google the exact number, I don't want to confuse you, but for sure, like between 800,000 and 1 million people by 1700, maybe even more, okay. It's a big deal, right? So demographically, France could not compete with these people here. So England and France were fighting each other. The French were blue coats, the English were red coats, okay. England actually recruited some German mercenaries, redcoats, to fight against France, and there were, of course, some Englishmen, English officers. And since England had more resources and England was a rich country, couldn't compare it with France. Okay, so and eventually England defeated France. England took over Canada. Okay, and since France retreated from here, Spain tried to claim it. Okay, and Spain, again, France also continued to claim it, but England didn't care too much about this area. So England took over Canada, the major hub of French domination, because that's where most of the French people live. So England took over Canada, and that's what right now, if you look here, you see the whole area now is colored in this pink brownish color. So the Canada, the colony of Canada was taken over by Britain. Okay, New England, of course, was Britain, dominated by Britain, and the British also claimed all this area. Okay, still, this remaining area was claimed by France. Okay, but French still continued to say, "Oh, it's ours, it's ours." But British merchants came here, so formally it was claimed by Britain. And Canada was for sure dominated by Britain, because the government was British here in Montreal, all these areas, Quebec, okay. And the Hudson Bay Company, English company, was dominating the trade with the Indians here, okay. So all this area. So England invested a lot in this fight against France, okay. English king invested a lot of money into what? In maintaining the army, in supplying the army that was fighting the French. So the expenses were huge, and the English treasury was empty. What the English king decided to do, he actually decided to raise taxes on colonists. Again, they didn't call Americans themselves at that time, but the people who later became known as Americans, okay, he said, you guys have to pay taxes. Okay, because we were fighting to defend you, we spent a lot of money, and now you have to pay back to cover our expenses. And colonists said, oh, we didn't ask you to fight, we didn't care. And indeed, a lot of farmers here didn't care, didn't give a damn about this war, and they said, we didn't ask you to fight, why should we pay additional taxes? Okay, so a lot of them refused to pay these taxes. Okay, so that's how the American Revolution started. It started as a tax dispute. Okay. In fact, to be honest, the English crown, the English king or English government back in the mother country, they were right. Formally, they were right, because compared to a mother country, Britain, Americans didn't pay so much taxes because of this benevolent negligence. Okay, because the government from England couldn't reach out to them, couldn't impose many taxes and say, okay, let it go. Okay, colonists paid fewer taxes than the people in the mother country. Okay, that's the irony of the situation. I want to emphasize it because sometimes there is this general perception that oh, Americans were abused by the English king because they were forced to pay too many taxes. No, they didn't pay many taxes. They paid less taxes than people back in England. But the very attempt of the English government to impose, to make them equal, to put them on the same plane with people back in the mother country, created this animosity on the part of Americans, again, on the people who would be called Americans or colonists. See, the desire on the English crown to put them on the same plane, to make them equal to the rest of the population in back in England. English farmers paid taxes, of course. They could be controlled by the king, by local sheriffs. They couldn't escape. Okay, small territory, it was easy to control them. But here in the North America, how could you control people, right? So that is why English government started to force colonists who lived in coastal cities, Boston, New York, which was easier to control in this case than farmers back in the frontier areas. Okay, so English government tried to impose the same taxes which they levied back in the mother country. Okay, the same taxes. You have to pay the same taxes as the rest of the population. And that's what created this anger on the part of colonists. Okay, so we don't want to pay these taxes. We don't want to pay these taxes. So to penalize colonists, and I repeat, the colonists conducted wide illicit trade. So they didn't want to pay customs duties. They didn't want to pay taxes. They wanted to trade directly with the Caribbean islands, with Latin America. And the Caribbean islands wanted to freely trade with North American colonies. And the trade was conducted by the smuggling. It was a vibrant smuggling business, okay, that bypassed, of course, any official taxes. Okay, so to penalize, somehow discipline colonists, the English king imposed these through the parliament, of course, these new laws: Stamp Act, Navigation Acts. Okay, again, Navigation Act. It was a very it was an act to penalize, purposely to penalize Americans. Okay. One of the stipulations of the Navigation Act was a requirement that you had to bring your goods to England and use English boats to transport your American goods. Okay, so the Americans had to put their American goods on English boats to bring them, let's say, to Jamaica. It's very ridiculous. So it retarded the entire trade. They wanted to ignore it. They despised it. Or Stamp Act. Okay, at that time, if you applied for if you sent an official application somewhere, you had to put a stamp. Again, don't think about stamps as some kind of, in old times, remember, before internet age, some of your fathers, mothers, or grandfathers, grandmothers, they used letters. They put stamps on them and send them in mail. And we still sometimes we do this, occasionally for fun. Okay. We don't do it anymore. Okay, but at that time, 1600, 1700, they used stamps everywhere. Not only they put stamps on letters to send letters to each other, okay, postal service, but they also put stamps if they wanted to claim some kind of, let's say, benefits, to file an application to go somewhere, or if they filed a complaint about something. So you have to put a stamp. It's like official seal, your signature, and a stamp. So almost all official documents had to have stamps. Okay, and these stamps cost money. So what English government did, they raised the price of these stamps. Okay, I don't remember what exact price was, but they raised the price. So it was an indirect tax. That's what we're talking about here, an indirect tax. Colonists who got used to high degree of self-government didn't want, of course, to have this crap, and that's how the slogan emerged: no taxation without representation. They actually sent a message, colonists. They said, okay, so we might agree to pay taxes, but at first we need to be represented in your government, in your parliament. Okay, we are not represented in your English parliament, so how are you going to tax us, without our consent? So we have to ask our opinion. Okay, we don't have any say about our life in the English parliament. And the parliament and the king said, oh, you don't need any representation. We already have a parliament back in England, so these are the people who speak on your behalf. But the colonists said, how is it? It doesn't make sense, because we're independent communities. We got used to high degree of self-government. So why don't you allow us to elect our representatives to represent us in the parliament, and then we will talk about taxes. Again, I'm simplifying the whole story just to make it understandable for us what was at stake, so what they were arguing about. Okay, so hence the slogan of no taxation without representation. And by the way, remember I told you once that this slogan actually had emerged prior to the American Revolution, when during the Netherlands Revolution against Spain, when Spain had made efforts to squash Holland or Netherlands, okay, this small country in Northern Europe, which originally was a province in Spain, and the Spanish king wanted to impose heavy taxes on them because Netherlands was like a merchant republic. The merchants controlled the life there, okay? So they had their own parliament, and he wanted to squash them by imposing huge taxes, and they revolted against the Spanish king. And that was the slogan they came up with: no taxation without representation. Okay, and then Americans replicated this slogan, okay? So England, to make a long story short, England didn't want to give rights to colonists, okay? In fact, there was a fear on the part of England that if they tried to collect the taxes, the colonists might resist. Why? Because colonists had a lot of guns on their hands, okay? It was normal. That's how this American tradition of gun ownership emerged, because at that time frontier population had to have guns, okay? Because the fights were constant, you know, defending the wars with the Native Americans again. Plus they were hunters, and that's how this culture of gun ownership emerged, okay? It wasn't something that emerged from nowhere. There was a powerful tradition, okay? Plus American farmers were moving further to the west, and England didn't want American farmers actually to compete with the English farmers back in mother country, okay? Because some English farmers complained that American grain producers compete with us. So American farmers, American settlers were restrained by the English government that told them, oh, don't go to the west. We don't want you to go to the west, okay? Oh, because Indians don't like it, and they didn't. Many Indians didn't like it. Indeed, didn't like it, okay? So that is why a lot of Indians supported the English crown against the Americans, because English crown didn't want Americans to go to the west, okay? For, of course, obvious selfish reasons, because American grain manufacturers competed with English farmers, okay? But it worked well for the American Indians, who didn't want American farmers to expand to the west, okay? So English government made some meager efforts to restrain the movement of American settlers to the west. Again, they didn't have enough resources, of course, to control this movement to the west, but at least they stationed some troops there, and they said, oh, we don't want you to be involved in the Indian fights, so we want you, don't move. There is a line by Appalachian Mountains. Formally, the English government drew a line and said, oh, you American farmers cannot go beyond these Appalachian Mountains, okay? And of course, on the ground, the many American settlers ignored this, but formally there was this requirement, you know, restriction. You cannot go beyond this line, Appalachian Mountains, okay? And it irritated, of course, settlers, American settlers who wanted to expand to the new lands. So it created additional tension between the English crown and the American settlers, okay, who were preyed on these Native American lands further to the west, okay? And since they had guns, settlers, England decided to confiscate these guns. That's how the first fight took place in this famous episode in Lexington, 1775, when so-called redcoats, the English troops, advanced toward Lexington, because there was a rumor that local farmers wanted to use guns against English representatives, tax collectors, whoever, okay, whoever represented England. So they advanced English troops trying to confiscate these guns, and they were met by these militiamen, farmers, who used the guns, hunting guns, against the English troops, and that the first blood was spilled, and that's how the war for independence started, okay? By the way, originally, the majority of founding fathers, the majority of colonists didn't want to secede from England, okay? They simply wanted representation in the English government, self-government. Okay, they were thinking about themselves as part of England. It was only in the course of the war, again, each war between different parts of the country or different parts of the country which are separated geographically. If they have a war, of course, the war contributes to the development of this new identity, like in a skyrocket manner we have during the war. Like two parts of the country developing separate identity, and that's what we have in case of England and English colonies. When as soon as they started to fight, this hatred, animosity of each other contributed to the development of a separate identity. So that's how we, after in the wake of the war, we had the English and the Americans. Okay, so because the war separated, the war drew the lines between these two groups of people. Okay. And I also forgot to tell you something that also contributed to this animosity, which sometimes our textbooks do not mention, okay? Which kind of added this fuel to the whole, created to the conflict, created prerequisites for this, this civil war, essentially, between two parts of English population separated geographically. The civil war that that led to the formation of a new nation. Okay, in the 1760s, English government was planning to appoint a bishop for Anglicans. There were some Anglicans in New England, in English colonies in North America. Remember who Anglicans were? Anglicans were people, conservative Protestants, essentially Catholics, who simply were controlled by the English king and by archbishop appointed by the English king. Okay, so the Anglican Church, conservative Protestant church, was controlled by the archbishop. Okay, and back in England, an English king planned to send a bishop to control Anglicans in North America in 1760s. Okay, so I'm going to send the bishop for Anglicans only, to be in charge of them, like a centralized structure. Okay, Anglicans, they didn't have a Roman Pope, again, didn't do any ritual changes, but only administratively Anglicans now were subjected to the control of the king, who appointed the archbishop to control the Anglican Church, and in this case he wanted to appoint the bishop to send him to North America to control Anglicans, okay, to supervise Anglicans. And that's what was done. But, and it's very important, this gesture, okay, to appoint an Anglican bishop for Anglicans only, created a bunch of rumors in New England among all Protestants that the English king wanted to subjugate them to the control of the bishop. Okay, and some wild rumors even said that, oh, English king wanted to subject us to the control of the Roman Pope. See, Protestants, they had this inherent fear that the Roman Pope would come and control them. But in this case, this gesture to have the bishop for the Anglicans created this bunch of rumors that, oh my God, all Protestants would be controlled by this Anglican bishop, who would be in charge of us, who would be telling us what to do. We hate them. We hate the English king. We hate England. We hate this, what he is going to do with us. See, that's important. So since people at that time were very religious, okay, now you can understand how this seemingly minor gesture created the big political consequences. Okay, how this episode contributed to what we call the American Revolution. Okay, now let's go back to this fight that took place 1775 between the farmers in Lexington, militia, and the English troops. The first blood was spilled, And then we have this famous episode with the Boston Tea Party, remember? Again, if you don't remember, I want to briefly outline this episode that English government gave monopoly rights to trade tea to East India Company that didn't pay taxes, okay? Enjoyed a bunch of privileges, and that's what was the goal of Americans or colonists at this point. You know, why do you want to make us equal to the rest of the English population, but here you have this monopoly that didn't pay any taxes? That was the message, okay? And you know the rest of the story, that Americans, a group of Americans dressed as Indians, they invaded this boat that belonged to East Indian Company and threw the boxes with tea, you know, overboard, and it created this mayhem, okay? The Declaration of Independence was written, again, Thomas Jefferson basically wrote it, as you know, I told you last time, again, 1776, the year when, remember, Adam Smith wrote his famous book called The Wealth of Nations, okay? The Gospel of Free Trade, the Gospel of Free Market. And here we have the Declaration of Independence, where we can find this famous Enlightenment jargon, Enlightenment phrases. Remember the famous phrase by John Locke that all men are created equal? Again, it was included here in the Declaration of Independence, this talk about natural rights, okay, that all men endowed with natural rights. It goes back to this tradition of natural laws, which we discussed last time, okay? And one thing leads to another thing, and eventually there was a Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress, when these separate colonies created militias, and they tried to put together the colonial army. They had Congress, Continental Congress, remember? This loose alliance of independent states. I repeat, each state was treating itself as an independent country, okay? But for the purposes of fighting against Britain, they united their efforts, okay? That's very important. Temporarily united their efforts. And they entrusted George Washington to lead the Continental Army against Britain, okay? And again, it took a lot of resources on the part of England to mobilize herself to fight colonies, okay? Because you have to deliver army supplies across the Atlantic Ocean. It was not an easy thing to do, okay? As I said, many, again, in fact, the majority of colonists didn't want to separate themselves from England, but the logical war, okay, when during the war you fight each other, people are killed on both sides, you come to hate. Both sides come to hate each other, and that's what happened in eastern part of North America, where in the course of the war, eventually the majority of colonists came to conclusion that yes, we need to create a separate nation. And by the way, the people who participated in this Revolutionary War, or who were active, like Boston Tea Party, taking part in Continental Army, revolting against England, it was a tiny minority of people, like about 5-6% of the population. The rest of colonists, farmers, they continued to live in frontier areas or in towns, or they were simply sitting on the fence waiting who would win, okay? So you have to understand this. It was a tiny part of people who were doing actual like fight. There were a lot of factors, and I list them here, factors that favored the rebels, okay? First, it was very hard, especially at that time, with those primitive ways of communication across the Atlantic. It was very hard for England transport goods, soldiers, supplies to colony. And even though when they could do it, to bring supplies and troops to colonies, it was hard actually to fight the Americans. Why? I included here a very useful phrase that will help you to understand why it was hard to fight Americans. One English general, in desperation, through this phrase, so he uttered, quote, "You cannot conquer a map," unquote, because the spaces of North America were so huge, the population was so sparse, it was literally impossible to chase the American army across these woods. And again, George Washington's small, tiny army was escaping. That was basically what it was, you know, the game of a cat and a mouse. Okay, so the English troops were chasing Americans, this hardly equipped, you know, undernourished, a bunch of people, militiamen, who were loosely brought together by French officers. I will tell you about this further, to kind of make up an American army. And they were escaping from the English troops, and the English troops had to chase them. And it was hard to chase them because many of these Americans knew the landscape. Okay, they could hide in the woods. And that's what it was. You know, of course, there were some famous battles, you know, Lexington battle, whatever, you know the history. But mostly it was chasing George Washington by the English army through the woods and mountains. And it was exhausting. It was exhausting. So you couldn't. In Europe, it was easy to do because the areas were so small, easily controlled. Okay, but here you couldn't do anything. Okay, with those primitive ways to communicate. So England was set to lose this war. And I said French officers, and it was important. So Americans benefited a lot from the French help. Okay, since France had been defeated by England. Remember, I just mentioned the 7-year war between France and England, and France lost to Britain. France lost Canada, part of Louisiana, to England. So they hated English and they wanted revenge, the French people, the French king. And so they decided to help Americans in the fight against England. So the French king actually sent French officers to North America to help George Washington to build up his army. Okay, and if you go to Washington, you will see in I hope it was not desecrated, this monument. Anyway, you would see the statue of Marquis de Lafayette. Okay, it's a French officer, French aristocrat, who was later, actually, he became a revolutionary. So for the common man, okay, who came here, Marquis de Lafayette, who came here to build up the American army. So he became the chief lieutenant of George Washington because he was an experienced officer. George Washington did take part, by the way, in a 7-year war, but he was not a trained officer, unlike these Frenchmen who came to help Americans. So Marquis de Lafayette was the chief lieutenant of George Washington to build up the American army. And there were many other French officers to help Americans to train the soldiers. Okay, so the French help was very much essential. And to celebrate the contribution of French, Americans built this monument in downtown Washington, the monument to Marquis de Lafayette. Okay, and the French also helped Americans with the Navy. Americans did have merchant marine navy, but they didn't have military navy. So French provided cannons, provided some Navy officers to be placed on American boats, okay, to conduct this fight against the English boats. It's very important. So the French contributed, built up the American Navy, okay. The French provided, as I said, cannons. So France, in fact, invested so much money into the American Revolution that by the time when Americans won this war against England, the French treasury was empty. Which, by the way, ironically, the fact that the treasury of the French king, who had helped American revolutionists to fight against England, opened the doors later to the French Revolution, okay? And you will find out later, we will have a special lecture on the French Revolution, how this chain of events led eventually to the American Revolution. So the French treasury was empty because they invested so much money into the American Revolution to help Americans. And the third major factor, that in the English Parliament, in the very English Parliament, there was actually there was no overwhelming support for this war against Americans. Why? Because some of these people who were sitting in the English Parliament, they were hesitant to completely side with the English king. They asked a simple question. Okay, guys, we had this glorious revolution, 1688. We had adopted the Bill of Rights, which granted rights to people, rights to be judged by the trial of jury. Again, a small group of people, like 4% of the population. Farmers were not yet included. We're talking about rich townspeople and aristocrats. But still, 4% of the population in England had some rights. Okay, the properties could not be confiscated. They had the right to elect representatives to the parliament. The king had to consult the parliament before he adopted the laws. So any laws had to carry the signature of the parliament. Okay, they couldn't be arbitrarily adopted by the king. So the power of the English king was balanced by the power of the English parliament. Remember, we talked about it. So some people who were sitting in the English parliament, they asked a legitimate question. They said, how come, why should we penalize these Americans or these colonists when they simply live up to our tradition? They simply want to expand this tradition. Okay, they want to include more people. So why should you deny the rights of farmers to contribute to the government, to become citizens, if they have property? Okay, so basically some people in the English Parliament, they said these Americans actually, they want to continue the ideals of our own revolution that we had made in 1688. Okay, so hence this half-hearted support. And when you don't have the overwhelming support in the war, so you are again on the train wreck to defeat. And that's what happened with England. So England kept fighting this war, losing a lot of money, resources, and eventually the English king said, okay, King George at that time was in power. I think George the third. I had enough of this, so let's give freedom, liberty to these damn Americans. And eventually a peace was signed, and that's how we have a first national liberation movement to win, you know, like an American republic that was created in the wake of this revolution. Okay, the first successful revolution of national liberation. So these colonists seceded and they created a nation. And by the way, they didn't have experience, of course, how to rule this. Of course, they knew they had experience how to rule them in the local government, but they didn't have this experience of how to organize the central government. And there were some voices, they said, oh, George Washington, so he contributed so much to our victory, so let's make him the king. Sounds bizarre to our ears today, right? The king of the United States. But there were some voices at that time which actually said that, oh, we might appoint or we might elect whatever George Washington as the king of the United States. And of course, George Washington himself dismissed this ridiculous idea, and we have to give him credit for this. He said, we had enough of kings, so let's get rid of this. And that's how this institution of presidency came to occupy the minds of founding fathers. Okay, you know that after the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States was signed. At first, it was, of course, I call it decentralized constitution, called the Articles of the Government. The first U.S. Constitution, they gave rights to states, wide rights to the states. And then the Constitution proper was signed that gave more rights to the central government, to kind of make a long story short. And that's what we have to the present day, where the Constitution of the United States, where the rights of the states were balanced by the power of the central government, and where the power of the central government is balanced by the rights of the states. Okay. What were the results of the revolution? Before we discuss the results of the revolution, let's address this issue. So what kind of government was created in the United States? Again, sometimes we say that, oh, we have democracy. Yes, there was a democracy, although it was limited democracy, you all see it. But at the same time, the political system which was established in the United States, it was a republic, a constitutional republic. Okay, it wasn't some kind of wide democracy. It was a republic where the power of on the ground was balanced by the Republican institutions. We have electoral college, we have institution of senators, okay, who originally were not elected. You have to remember, senators were not elected. They were appointed by state legislators, okay, unlike House of Representatives, where people could be elected, grassroots could elect, but senators, to balance the power of masses, were elected by the state legislators. It was only later the state senators were elected. So there was a government created based on the principle of checks and balances. Remember, Montesquieu checks and balances, where, yes, there should be democracy on the ground, but this democracy, in order not to squash the rights of minorities or other states, should be balanced by some Republican institutions like electoral college, senators. Okay, otherwise there's big states with a lot of populations, they would squash small states. Okay, they would overwhelm small states which might not have enough representatives. Okay, that is why they have to have equal representation in the Senate, and that is why the presidential elections should be done on the basis of the electoral college, okay, to make sure that the power is balanced, okay, spread among all states. And of course, some people don't like this system, some people love this system, and to the present day we debate it, okay. But that's how it had been said, that electoral college presidential elections, which are done on the basis of the electoral college, the system exists to balance the power, okay. Otherwise the small, less populous states would lose, okay. Anyway, what were the results of the American Revolution? The results were mixed from present viewpoint, okay. First, it was a great accomplishment. It was the first country in the modern world to create this republican form of government. Of course, there was Netherlands. Again, I always say there was Netherlands, that was a merchant republic, but it was a tiny country. Here we have a big chunk of land, okay, where a republican government was established. No kings, no queens, okay. White male property owners became citizens, okay. Roughly, again, it's we don't know exactly, but let's say like 20% of people became citizens, okay. 20% of people. Unlike in England, where only 4% of the population had rights. Remember, farmers were not included. Here in the United States, we have farmers, okay. Farmers being included into the pool of citizens, as long as you had a cow, or like like a field, a property, so you could be considered and you were male, you were considered a legitimate citizen. You could elect and be elected potentially, of course, not some not everybody entered the government, but potentially you could enter a government if you wanted, if you're a white male and a farmer, okay, small farmer. Not all white males, of course, became citizens. Like if those white males who didn't have property, they were not citizens, okay. But in several states, I forgot, Vermont and Maine, I think, all white males became citizens, okay. So those people who were citizens, they could vote, hold office, testify in courts, no economic restrictions, and the freedom of religion was also announced. Okay, American Bill of Rights gave more freedoms to people than the English Bill of Rights. Okay, for instance, English Bill of Rights denied Catholics to right like free worship, but here all religions had the right to worship. Okay. No restrictions. So you are free to worship, Catholics, Protestants, whatever denomination. It's much, I would say, American Bill of Rights was more progressive than English Bill of Rights, okay? And on overall, American system was more progressive than the English system. Of course, and I have to stress this, from the present viewpoint, if you judge the American Revolution from a present viewpoint, it was not good. It was no good because only 20% of people were enfranchised. Again, it's a bookish word to say that people received rights. Only 20%, roughly 20% received rights. But it's now a very important emphasis compared to other parts of the world. If you, for instance, compare the regime established, Republican regime established in the United States in the wake of the revolution, if you compare this stuff with the, let's say, Ottoman Empire, Chinese Empire, Russian Empire, or this European royal states, of course, American Republic was more advanced, more progressive, okay? So that's what I'm saying. So you have to judge American Revolution on the basis of standards of that time. Okay, not on the basis of the present standards. And that's what mistake we frequently make. We begin to morally judge the people in the past from our present viewpoint. Okay. As I said, there are two ways to approach history. I call it journalistic way to approach history, when you issue moral judgments and do this virtue signaling. So if I had been the such and such person, if I had lived in Middle Ages, I wouldn't burn a witch. I wouldn't come to Central Plaza to watch how this innocent man, a woman, was burned at the stake, and I would courageously jump at this estacade, okay, this fire pyre, and I would have saved this man or woman, you know. But again, you are issuing judgment from a present viewpoint, okay? If you put yourself in the shoes of a person of that time, I'm sure you would have acted differently. So anyway, judging by the standards of that time, 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, the American Revolution was very much progressive. It became the role model for many other areas of the world, okay, who aspired to bring freedom, liberty, okay. But at the same time, it was obvious that there were many chunks of segments of population who didn't get any rights, okay. And the first big group of people who were denied rights were women, okay. Half of society were not citizens because they simply were ignored. And unfortunately, that's how it was at that time, you know. Entire globe was very much male-oriented, so women were totally excluded. In some countries, they were simply treated as a second-class citizen, okay. Ottoman Empire, again, Russian Empire. Here had no rights again. in the wake of the revolution. They were talking about man, only man. All men were created equal. Okay, unfortunately, these were the standards of that time. Okay, black slaves were denied any rights. In fact, at the very end of the war, Revolutionary War, some English officers trying to save New England, the British colonies, they tried to lure the slaves, said, hey, we would give you freedom, come with us to fight against these Americans. Okay, and not many joined, because again, it was insincere promises, just a lame last-ditch attempt, to save the situation. Not many slaves joined the English cause. Okay, and there were some slaves actually were fighting on the side of Americans in hope that they would be granted freedom, but they were not granted freedom. Okay, why? Because there was a powerful slave lobby. The southern plantation owners in Virginia, Carolinas. Okay, they were very influential. Okay, so that is why those founding fathers who didn't like slavery, so they had to compromise with these people. Okay, and I want to emphasize this again, that a lot of intellectuals in colonies, they actually didn't like slavery. Okay, they were on the same plane with Adam Smith. They didn't believe in slavery. They thought that slavery should be eliminated. It was the dying institution. We should get rid of it. But unfortunately, we had a bunch of these people who, like albatross on our neck, the southern plantation owners who were expanding their business. There's cotton, tobacco, rice plantations. It was expanding at that time. Okay, so they had to conclude it was like the pact with the devil. So they concluded. Northerners concluded the compromise with these slave owners, and slaves were denied any rights. So they were denied rights. It was another group of population that was excluded. And finally, we have America. In fact, to be exact, the status of slaves hardly changed before revolution, after revolution. So they remained slaves. Okay, women, no change. Before the revolution, they had no rights. After revolution, they didn't have rights either. So these two groups of population were not citizens. Okay, but for American Indians, the third group of population, situation became worse. Okay, because before the revolution, at least the lands were shielded, the Mississippi Valley area. Okay, and at some point, England made this lame attempt to put the troops on the western line, Appalachian Mountains, by telling Americans, don't go beyond this point, don't go to the west. As I said, that was a lame attempt, but at least it was something. So that is why many American Indians sided with the English, okay, because they were afraid of this American advance on their lands. And that is why Americans cracked down on them, took over their lands in the wake of the revolution, immediately expanded in Ohio, in Georgia, Tennessee, okay, all these areas, seizing the Indian lands, okay, because that was the expectation on the part of Americans that, okay, as soon as we got rid of England, the frontier would be open. Okay, it would be an open season on Indian lands, and that's exactly what happened. So there was a huge movement to the west. Settlers moved, occupying, especially in Ohio, this fertile area, fertile lands of Ohio were quickly occupied and divided among settlers. Okay, it was a quick movement. So American Indians had to fight, or they had to escape further to the west, and eventually, on many occasions, they were rounded up and moved by Americans to the west. And later, in the early 19th century, they were actually removed west of Mississippi, as you know, to Oklahoma, where Oklahoma was designated as this Indian nations. That was the label. Okay, that's where a lot of American Indians from eastern states were removed, and Oklahoma was eventually designated as the special territory where all eastern Native Americans had to be moved to. Okay, that's how Oklahoma became the Indian territory at that time. Okay, so the status of American Indians was much worse than before the revolution. Okay, and that was the story of the American Revolution. Okay, on this note, I would like to finish the story. Okay, the government established as a result of the American Revolution was the government of property owners, this middle class people, primarily white, artisans, farmers, merchants. Okay, who else? Some bankers, middle class people. Okay, middle class people, property owners. Of course, there were more opportunities, and again, this country loosely named the United States, and again at that time the expression United States was used in plural. Okay, United States are, United States were, because the perception was that the states were very much independent units. Okay, they had their own militia, they should have their own taxes, but gradually, as a result of revolution, we already have the formation of the national government. So more and more we have these states being united in a unified nation again, and the fighting the war against England actually contributed to the formation of Americans as this unified nation. Okay, so the states delegated some of their rights to the national government. Okay, to levy the federal taxes, to have the army, okay, the national army, and so forth. Okay, you read the Constitution, you will find out. So the American Republic, the child of Enlightenment, won, and it became a role model for many other countries in the world that wanted to continue what follow this example, or developing further the freedoms established by the Americans. So the American Revolution became the role model for the French Revolution, for Latin American revolutions. Okay, so we have to stress this. And on this note, I'm going to finish. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you next time.